In fables and legends, monsters, most of them, have something in common between them. They hide. They hide under a bridge, they hide under your bed, they hide in a cave. And that is probably because real monsters hide too. Sometimes in the pages of history where you'd never expect them. The man who stood in Rheims Cathedral beside Joan d'Arc would a decade later stand in a courtroom accused of strangling children with his own hands, then burning their bodies in his castle Great Hearts. But in 1429, Gilles de Rais was the very image of a hero. He was born around 1405 into one of the richest and most powerful noble families in France. His childhood was one of privilege, sprawling estates across Brittany, Anjou, and Poitou. By the way, do forgive my French pronunciation during this whole thing. I am not good at it. He had the finest tutors, the training of a knight from the moment he could ride a horse. He grew up with every advantage, wealth, prestige, and the certainty that greatness was his birthright. And he did seem destined to deliver on it. By his early 20s, Gilles had already ridden into battle during the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had drained France's spirit for nearly a century. The English and their Burgundian allies occupied vast swathes of French territories. Morale was collapsing. The French heir, Charles, clung to power but seemed incapable of turning the tide. Then came Joan of Arc. A peasant girl who claimed God had sent her to save France. And whether you believed her or not, she brought with her something the French army hadn't seen in years: hope. Gilles met her in 1429, on the eve of the Loire campaign, and almost immediately became one of her closest allies. At the Siege of Orléans, the battle that would change the war, Gilles fought in the thick of the fighting, rallying troops and protecting Joan as she led the assault against the English. For his courage, the Dauphin rewarded him with the title of Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors in the kingdom. From Orléans, they marched together to more victories, only to finally arrive in Rheims, where Charles was crowned King of France. Gilles stood in the cathedral as the oil of coronation was poured, bells ringing all around. But that day, amidst the glory of victory, the glory of the rebirth of France as a unified kingdom, a killer was standing in the midst of heroes, a serial killer hidden in the pages of history. Just another monster. Today, we explore the depravity of Gilles de Rais and his descent into darkness. The war that had given Gilles de Rais his purpose was ending. Joan d'Arc was gone, captured, sold to the English, and burned at the stake in Rouen. Gilles had not been there to save her. Some say politics kept him away, others that he was already drifting from the battlefield. In peacetime, he turned his energy and fortune towards something else: spectacle. At his castles, the feasts became legendary. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted game. Sugared fruits and imported wines were aplenty. Gold plate and silver goblets glittered in the candlelight. His servants wore silks and velvets. Musicians played while actors performed elaborate dramas. Gilles himself sometimes took the stage, dressed in costumes sewn with real gold thread. He commissioned a play called Le Mystère du Siege d'Orléans, dramatizing the very battles he had fought alongside Joan. It required hundreds of actors, elaborate sets, and free admission for the public, with food and drink provided at his own expense. The costs were astronomical, but Gilles cared nothing for the cost. In fact, he seemed almost determined to burn through his fortune as quickly as possible. He sold off lands to fund his extravagance, borrowing heavily against what remained. And as his debts mounted, the tone of the entertainments began to change. Witnesses later recalled that Gilles became obsessed with darker themes. He was obsessed with the arcane and the occult, the philosopher's stone, alchemy, summoning spirits. He hired so-called professionals in these fields, promising them gold and protection in exchange for unlocking the secrets of limitless wealth. Some of these men would later testify against him, describing rituals in which Gilles invoked demons by name. And there were rumors, ugly ones, that in the upper chambers of the castles, strange visitors came and went. Boys from nearby villages, pages from traveling families, children of the poor who vanished without explanation. At the time, these whispers were easily dismissed. Gilles was still a nobleman, still the Marshal of France, still untouchable to most. There were 1,000 ways to explain the disappearance of these children. And what about the strange fires that burned late into the night in the castle hearts? Simply servants disposing of refuse, so they said. And so time passed. The accusations did not erupt overnight. They kept existing as rumors, the kind peasants whisper to each other over market stalls, or mutter to their children to keep them from wandering near the castle. But over time, those whispers began to take form. Names of missing children, villages left in mourning, servants who had seen something. It started to mount up too much. Too many names, too many disappearances. Now, usually, we would go into what Gilles had done in a more cinematic way, but you do know how I love sources, so in order to follow them, we need to start from the ending. When Gilles was finally arrested in 1440, the court in Nanterre summoned dozens of witnesses, peasants, servants, priests, and of course, Gilles' own household staff. From their testimony emerged a portrait of calculated horror. And that testimony is what we are going to follow today. According to the testimonies, Gilles would send his servants into nearby villages, often under the pretense of recruiting boys as pages or choir singers, or even simply to perform errands for the great lord. Sometimes it was as simple as offering a coin to a hungry child to carry a message or deliver a package. Once inside the castle, the child might be given food, fine clothes, even a warm bath, luxuries far beyond their normal life. Gilles would speak to them kindly at first. Witnesses described him as capable of a sudden kind of charm, the sort of man who could make a terrified boy feel safe, at least for a little while. He lured them in, make them feel at ease, preparing for the unspeakable darkness waiting. When placed under the pressure of the court, servants finally spoke of Gilles engaging in acts of sexual violence, followed by killing the children in ways that were both intimate and ritualized. The methods used in these tragic killings were varied. Some were strangled with cords, others decapitated with a short sword he kept for this exact purpose. Gilles reportedly insisted on being the one to strike the killing blow, sometimes after moments of false comfort or faint mercy. As if in one of his plays, he would work as hard as possible to elicit as much emotion as possible. Fear, in this case. We get these details especially from one of his closest accomplices, Henriette. She testified that Gilles took great delight in watching the life leave his victim's eyes. At times, he would order his servants to reassure the child in soft tones right before the attack, making the moment of betrayal all the more cruel. The bodies were never buried. Instead, they were burned in the great fireplace of the castle upper rooms. Not the kitchen hearths, but the ornate chambers meant for noble guests. Servants would then sift through the ashes, discarding any bones into the moat or, in some cases, the nearby fields. From the testimonies and the trial records, we get an idea of how things were done. Henriette described ropes being prepared beforehand for strangulation. they were ritualizing the entire thing, preparing, like they were preparing a dinner or a theater play. And here we enter a topic that is debated. We don't wanna defend Gilles, of course, but we have to say that in these kind of trials, especially at the time, legends and exaggerations are created, since we don't have forensic to help. What we can say is that some pages testified that Gilles sometimes kissed the dead children before ordering their destruction by fire. There was reference in the testimonies to beautiful heads or well-formed limbs, suggesting a grotesque aesthetic appreciation for the victims. Gilles sometimes lingered with the body, caressing it, whispering prayers not of mercy but of invocation, as though the act itself were a part of a greater ritual. Something we'll go over in a second. What we can say for certain is that the servants knew, but could they do something about it? They were bound by loyalty, of course, but especially by fear of what Gilles could do. He was a renowned hero, and to accuse him was, well, a dangerous thing to do. Losing one's job to the hero of France could mean no one else would hire you. And, well, in late medieval France, the economic structure didn't mean you could just change jobs that easily. I want to avoid the mistake that is often done to allow these children to just be a side character to the story of Gilles. After all, they are the victims. So we will talk about one of the few who we know something about. His name was Guillaume, a village boy promised work in the kitchens. His uncle testified that he saw the boy ride away with Gilles' men, smiling, proud. He was never seen again. We don't know details about this boy's life, but we can imagine. He was just a young boy who got offered the chance of a lifetime, to earn a keep, to be proudly serving a man he probably admired deeply. Another boy was called Chateaubriand, prized for his singing voice. He performed in Gilles' hall before noble guests, then vanished that very night. Servants later whispered that his voice pleased the Lord greatly. One might say that his talent killed him, but it's not true, is it? There is, after all, no real pattern in the killings. Gilles killed boys with special talents and boys who didn't present any particular feature. One child, then another. Dozens. Some chroniclers said hundreds. Some, in modern days, claim even between 200 and 600, but that is probably an exaggeration. The true number is lost forever in the smoke of those castle fires. For nearly a decade, from the early 1430s, right after the end of his war with Jeanne d'Arc, until his arrest in 1440, children vanished into Gilles' castle. His killing spree lasted roughly 7 to 8 years. At the same time, he was spending every single coin he had, as if he was burning himself up, doing everything he wanted, knowing his time was going to end soon. Now, according to his servants, while he was killing these boys, while he was violating them before and after death, he whispered prayers to demons. He knew their names. He communicated with them. Now, what does this mean? It is possible that it is just true, a true testimony in a true trial. But it is, of course, possible that this is just their way to put more of the guilt on the head of Gilles. After all, they helped. They held down the boys. They tied them up. They did a lot of the work. So they were very motivated to put the guilt outside of themselves on Gilles and on the devil. But by the 1440, the walls of silence around the castle of death had begun to crack. The first problem that made Gilles weak enough for people to start talking was, of course, economical. His debts were insurmountable, his lands nearly gone, and his behavior was too erratic to ignore. The Duke of Brittany, who was quietly acquiring Gilles' properties through foreclosures, finally moved. The charges were at first mundane: kidnapping, illegal seizure of property, financial misconduct. But as the inquiries deepened, darker accusations surfaced. Parents of missing children began to speak. Servants whispered. Rumors coalesced into testimonies. And so the trial of Gilles de Rais began in the city of Nantes in September. It was a spectacle that drew crowds daily. Nobles, clergy, peasants alike, all eager to see what truth would emerge about the man once hailed as the hero of France. The court was not kind. Gilles faced both secular judges and ecclesiastical authorities, his crimes touching both law and faith. The church sought to expose his heresy, his dealings with demons, all while the civil court demanded justice for the murdered children. At first, Gilles blustered. He denied the charges, mocked the court, accused his enemies of fabricating lies to steal his lands. He railed at the witnesses, declaring them liars, but then came the testimonies, one after the other, relentless. Henriette and Poitou, broken under interrogation, described everything. They were loyal, they tried not to talk. They confessed to their part in the crimes, to holding down children, to burning bodies, to the fear that had ruled their lives under Gilles. Then came the parents. Dozens of families took the stand, their grief filling the chamber. And as the evidence mounted, Gilles cracked. On October 21st, he broke down in open court. He confessed not only to the murders, but even to the diabolical rites he had practiced. He admitted to invoking demons, to hoping that blood and sacrifice would bring him fortune. His words horrified the judges, and also confirmed what many had whispered, that indeed the Marshal of France had become a servant to the devil. One chronicler wrote that his confession astonished all present, for he spoke without shame, with the same eloquence he had used to urge men into battle. But the confession alone did not satisfy the court. They wanted detail, and Gilles gave it. He described luring the children, dressing them in silks, showing them kindness, then killing them. He admitted to taking pleasure in their death. He admitted to desecrating their bodies. The judges pressed him. How many? Gilles answered vaguely. Too many to recall. The court recoiled. There was no mercy to be found. His accomplices were condemned alongside him, but it was Gilles who bore the full weight of infamy. The verdict was clear: guilty of heresy, sodomy, and the murder of countless children. The sentence, ironic since he was a strangler mainly, death by hanging. His body to be burned so that no trace would remain. Now, modern historians have debated these confessions. In the 15th century, the threat of torture was often enough to force anyone's admission. Yet, many of the details Gilles provided in his statement matched the earlier independent testimonies of his servant, suggesting either careful coaching or grim truth. Those who saw he provide testimony say that while he claimed to feel remorse, he spoke with a strange detachment, as though recounting events from someone else's life. The political dimension cannot be ignored. By the time of his arrest, Gilles' fortune was in ruins. He had sold much of his land to powerful neighbors, including the Duke of Brittany we already cited. Some argue that removing Gilles entirely and seizing what little remained was as much of a motive as any moral outrage, and that was probably the reason why the trial began. But it has to be said that to condemn him, all of this was unnecessary, a little too much. Anyway, on October 26, 1440, the city of Nanterre awoke to a spectacle unlike any it had seen before. Crowds filled the streets. Everyone pressed toward the meadow outside the city walls, where 3 gallows had been erected. Upon them would hang Gilles de Rais, once Marshal of France, alongside his accomplices, Henriette and Poitou. The mood was conflicted. Some came out of morbid curiosity, eager to see a monster punished. Others wept openly, unable to reconcile the man they had once hailed as hero with the confessed murderer of children standing before them. Many simply wanted closure, to see justice done for the boys and girls who had vanished. Gilles himself did not resist his fate. After his confession, he had thrown himself upon the mercy of the church. He had received absolution, and in his final days, he seemed almost serene. Chroniclers say he comforted Henriette and Poitou, urging them to repent so that their souls might be saved. The condemned were led out, dressed in black robes, escorted by clerics chanting prayers. Gilles held a crucifix in his hands, his lips moving in prayer. Witnesses said he wept, but whether for remorse, fear, or relief, no one could tell. At the gallows, Gilles addressed the crowd. His words, recorded in fragments, were a final performance. He urged parents to guard their children more closely than they had in the past. He begged forgiveness of God, of the church, and of those he had wronged. He admitted his sins fully, leaving no doubt to his guilt. Then the execution began. Henriette and Poitou were hanged first, their bodies swinging before the crowd. And finally, Gilles himself was bound and lifted. The rope tightened, his body convulsed, and the Marshal of France, comrade of Joan d'Arc, hero of Orléans, died as a common criminal. When it was done, the bodies were cut down. Henriette and Poitou were burned, their ashes scattered to prevent any relic or memory. Gilles' body, however, was spared the fire in the end. His family had petitioned successfully for mercy, and so his corpse was delivered to the nuns of the Carmelite convent in Nanterre for burial. Even in death, the nobility of his blood afforded him a privilege his victims never had. The execution left France shaken. How could one of its greatest warriors, a man so close to a saint, fall so far? For years, people struggled to reconcile the image of the shining knight with the monster described in court. Some whispered that Gilles was framed, that jealous nobles had tried to smear his name, as we said. But this opinion didn't become mainstream because of how detailed the confessions were. It didn't seem fake. Centuries later, writers would weave his story into folklore. Some believe he inspired the tale of Bluebeard, the nobleman who lured wives into his castle only to kill them. Others link his name to Gothic stories of satanic pacts and bloody rituals. The meadow he was hanged in is long gone. The castles where children vanished had fallen into ruin. But the shadow of Gilles de Rais still lingers. A reminder that evil can wear the face of a hero, and that the same energy that can fuel the fires of ambition can burn into something far darker.